Hello, I'm Kim Belair, and on stage around is David Bedard. We're writers and narrative designers, and we're also the founders of Sweet Baby Inc. Sweet Baby Inc. is a narrative development company with a physical space in Montreal, where I am right now, and a distributed team working remotely. And when we say that we're a narrative development company, it's a term that we use to encapsulate like a lot of the stuff that we do, which ranges from consults and script writing to narrative direction and cultural assessments. It's kind of a full service thing where we work on games with like a lot of different clients in a lot of very, very different ways. And that means we've had to be very, very flexible, of course, in the way that we work, while also developing a very rigorous production and organizational structure to keep us on track and working to like a dozen client schedules at a time without breaking our own. No matter what happens, we as Sweet Baby need to be able to stay working about 9 to 5. We need to be salaried and comfortable, and we need to keep our own work-life balance while also shifting to the demands of like a lot of different projects. And that's been great, but it's also meant that we have to be equally rigorous in our production pipelines as we are in managing just the way that we're treated and ensuring that any challenging collaboration gets handled as quickly as possible with as much empathy as firmness. So today, I think what we want to do is just kind of share some of the things that we've seen in terms of tough collaborations and a bit of what we think might hopefully have helped them go more smoothly, or at least kind of share this is when we knew that it was time to say, forget it, and walk away. So first off, I think it's important to say that collaboration can be challenging. Most collaborations are going to be challenging a little bit, especially at the beginning, because there's a rhythm to collaboration and a language to learn. And even in best case client scenarios, we have to embed, right? And that naturally takes a bit of time. So to start, we kind of wanted to give a couple examples without naming names of things that have gone kind of poorly and that we'd like to kind of share. So I'll start with Project A. We joined a project that looked really, really great. The game was stunning. It had a diverse cast, and we were told, of course, that it needed our diverse voices. And it also lined up with our gameplay sensibilities. And when we got on board the team, they promised us this thing was ready to write. It's got everything it needs. The blocks are all there. We just need to put the words in. We'll show you here, and we'll build the final systems. But what happened was it was not ready to write. And the systems that were promised were never built because as we went through this project, the studio began shedding seniors and replacing them with juniors. And suddenly the expectation became that the work we were promised would be done in the dark. We ended up, and I'm not proud of this, but we basically writing an entire game without level design block out for a lot of the experience. And on top of that, like the marginalized perspectives that we were consistently reassured were behind our hiring ended up being fully lip service. They wanted a diverse team, but they didn't want to have to represent them or make any changes. And we eventually, of course, just said, there's not much more we can do here. It's not coming together. And we walked away. So Project B was another collaboration that was literally years in the making. It had this lengthy runway of conversations. And every time we met with them, they stressed the importance of our team and its specific makeup being key to crafting the franchise narrative and offering our perspective on characters and story. We spent ages, just months, figuring it all out, and at every gate, reassurances were made that we're the right people, we'll be able to shape this game, we're going to be fully embedded and embraced, and we were told specifically that our role as contractors in the studio would actually give us a lot of freedom and a lot of movement and allow us to do really specific work. And so what happened, of course, because this is this talk, is that we joined with a ton of excitement, but ultimately ended up shoved pretty hard into this internal hierarchy of like this deeply hierarchical place. Like all of a sudden there were these soft rules about who can speak to who and when. There are these unspoken grudges and politics, and some very loudly spoken grudges and politics. There was public disrespect that we were witnessing happening like in meetings just between developers. And obviously we're contractors, but we still brought this up to management and it got a shrug. They said like, no, don't worry about it, you're not part of this. Our job is to fix the studio, we're going to handle this, and just do your work as contractors. And so, with a certain amount of hope early on, we did. And still, we checked what was needed, and eventually we were asked to do this huge, involved narrative document to solve this problem that the team had been having with the story, and especially the later parts of the story. And so we submitted this document, and we were expecting some kind of creative feedback, because finally it got up to the creative director. And after everything, after working on this super hard, after trying to navigate it and trying to give something of ourselves to the team that they had asked for, we got this quote that we'll never forget from the creative director, who had nothing to say about the narrative, nothing to say about any of the creative. It was just an email that says, "Why are outsourcers writing our ending?" Because that was all that mattered. It didn't matter what we did, it mattered who we were. And so we left the project at that point within days. So finally, Project C is a little different in that this is a project we worked on an ongoing basis, with a process that very early on was sold as easy and friendly, and very much felt easy and friendly. And it allowed us to meaningfully embed with the team to share values and build a narrative and tell the story that really did work for all of us. It felt perfect in a lot of ways that a lot of game dev collaborations don't, but that looseness and that vibe meant that very few deadlines or refined narrative pipelines were built. And often we found that our desire to be good teammates saw us taking on more than we should have to kind of fill in gaps, while our status as contractors still kept us on the outside of very meaningful decisions. So what happened was that easy and friendly process was mentally and emotionally true, which is wonderful, but it fell apart very quickly when production hit snags. And kind of as a result of the focus being on that easy relationship versus something more rigorous, a lot of production nuance ended up left unspoken. And that meant that when things changed on production or alterations were made to scope, there was this assumed shared understanding based on a general sense of alignment, but there were no actual processes to determine or ratify that alignment. And so a lack of micromanagement, which is nice, easily became a lack of management at all, and resulted in these assumptions being held as truths. And they were held as truths that we were assumed to inherit just because we vibed, but that didn't really exist in a more meaningful way beyond that. And it took a long time for us to fix, and we did, I think, and we're happy about that, but so much of that time could have been spent on making the game better rather than resolving something that we should have done at the outset. Because just to say it, I think, we also make mistakes. There are plenty of things internally that we are still building, and we very much respect how challenging this stuff is, right? We're a kind of company that we're still kind of figuring out how we operate. We're relatively new to the game, but this talk, I just want to make sure, is not just for venting. It's mostly to share some realizations that we've had. The first, I think, being that our issues with clients tend to fall into two distinct categories. The first is a lack of clarity on how our work even functions, how narrative works in our case, but I think it goes across the board. Because a lot of times we find that when we're hired, there's a faulty perspective on what writers and narrative designers need to work and how they work. There's this assumption that kind of you get a contractor fully formed. But the second focus is a lack of focus on people and a perception of projects as being importantly work first, game first, and then humans second, contractors third. And I think looking at those, regardless of what we do, like if we weren't in narrative or writing, I think we'd still have this problem as contractors. We see that the core issue here is a way that teams and companies view contractors and outside help. So the question becomes, how are contractors seen? And I think from our perspective, a fundamental issue is that contractors are often perceived as a tool. They're like a hammer that you can grab to go at some nails, and in a good scenario, just be an easy solve. And contractors are also seen as workers who can perform a task without like the pesky overhead of HR. They're a quick fix, little context is needed, and contractors provide a way to weaponize talent without the company having to consider the human behind it. We become this extension of the team itself, but wielded by their hand. And I think in a cohesive, empathetic, kind, community-focused, organized, well-produced, and efficient game production process, this relationship could be a beautiful symbiosis. But that's just not how most games work. There are no nails simple enough to just wield a hammer against them, and to me, what contractors are in an ideal scenario here is collaborators. People you invite into your team. Because with luck, you've hired people who are experts in their own field and who are deeply knowledgeable about the discipline, and who have taken that knowledge and made a living not only from that knowledge, but of grasping context very quickly, producing that very efficiently, and applying their knowledge to a project in an ongoing manner. And while it's tempting, I think, to assume that this external role of a contractor or of a craftsperson here creates distance between that person and the team, I think that the reality is that games require creative collaboration and shared vision. And there's often actually more work to be done to bring contractors in to share that vision and to make them cohesively and in terms of their own perspective and knowledge part of that system. So to that end, we came up with some guidelines, just some thoughts and stuff that David's going to take us through, and that hopefully provide at least like the beginnings of some structure or just some ideas to think on about how we can kind of do this better.
All right. Hi, I'm David. We've said it before already, but every collaboration is challenging to some degree. That's just what collaborations are. But we've found solutions to lean on when challenges do happen, because they will. We've worked through the challenges, and we now know things that we wished we knew before we left some of these projects. So first up, we're going to talk about what to do before you're bringing in external collaborators. The very first question you need to ask yourself is, why do you want to bring on an external collaborator? What is the problem that you're trying to fix? And really, the real question is, are you ready to solve this problem, or do you wish to be told that there is no problem? If you're bringing in a producer, are you ready to change the way you're doing things? If you're bringing in a sound designer, are you ready to invest in some tools so that they are able to do their work better? If you're bringing in a sensitivity reader, are you ready to examine your own biases, because it's going to happen? We can sense as collaborators when the client is asking for safety versus asking for changes. And the best collaborations are when people are willing to change. Next question is, what are you paying for? Are you paying for an opinion that you are maybe or maybe not going to implement? Are you paying for a content producer with strict deadlines? Or are you paying for a co-creator with many responsibilities and lots of autonomy? These are all very, very different. They're quoted differently. The contract is different. They're built differently. And they need different levels of access and onboarding to your project. You have to be ready for this, and you have to adapt based on what you actually want. And the other question you need to ask yourself, because we always get asked this, is it really full-time, or are you just trying to lock them down? There's no benefit in locking down a freelancer. We're used to doing the work on time according to your schedule. If they take the work, it's because they know that they can do this in this amount of time. No need for full-time if the freelancer knows that they can do this work. Remember, freelancers get better because they do more projects at the same time. They accumulate more experience over time, over a shorter amount of time, because they touch many different projects. And locking them down prevents that. Before you sign the contract, you're going to want to talk about deliverables. The first question is, do you know the deliverables ahead of time as the client? You might not, and that's okay, but that means you're not asking for a content producer, you're asking for somebody to fill a full role within your team. And then when that happens, you have to ask yourself, who's going to determine the deliverables? More often than you think, we as contractors are asked to onboard to a project, and then we're asked, okay, what should we do first? So we have to determine the steps between nothing and something. When that happens, we become a team member, whether we're contractors or not. And we're hired for our expertise, not just our time. And so you as a client end up bringing someone who will need to be very embedded in the team. It's important to have that conversation before the contract to determine the place that your contractor is going to have within your team ahead of time, and to make that space in your team within your project. We're always asked in the first opening calls, when's the right moment to bring us on? And we don't really know what the right time is. It depends for every project. We do know one thing, though. There is such a thing as too late. And when there isn't time to do meaningful work, when you're up against the wall and you're like, we're going to bring in somebody because we're out of time, chances are this collaborator will also not have enough time to do their work. And it might not be a good idea to bring someone else to the mix who will also get crunched and turn in subpar work due to the circumstances. And there is also no such thing as too early. Oftentimes, clients will wait to be ready to bring somebody on, to have enough documentation, to have enough, for the vision to stabilize. And the best way we found to work, honestly, is as early as possible so that we can follow the project along. It's not about influencing the project, it's about knowing and being there and avoiding pitfalls before they happen. So we like to onboard very early on and do regular check-ins monthly or quarterly before production starts. That way we have time to build project knowledge. We can add our opinions and influences to the project when it's needed in order to be ready to hit the ground running when the production starts. This avoids things like calling into question major game pillars halfway through production because we weren't there before we actually had to encounter them. This prep time is not time consuming. This can happen as a couple times a month, which means it's a couple hours for us and it's not super expensive. And it really helps collaboration be easier in the long run. So please consider bringing any external collaborators you would want early on, even just to see what the project is like and to have a long rampway towards your successful collaboration. Now you've decided to work with a collaborator and you've signed a contract. We have some guidelines for that too. You have to remember that they're game developers. The way contracting works, oftentimes, is that we will have one point of contact with your team, somebody who's responsible for talking to us. And it's also the responsibility, because we're game developers, to give us as much information as possible on the game. And that's on top of their regular responsibilities on your team. This means that despite their best efforts, they're only human, and we can't get a full vision of what's happening on your entire team. And we're kept in the dark. And we can't do our best work without the context of your wider game, just like your regular employees. So don't treat your contractors like a service house. External developers do their best work when they are part of the team. Invite them to syncs and end of sprint reviews, and have them meet the whole team, even if it's just like an hour long of fun facts. And don't just have a private channel where you talk to the contractors in one person. That's never useful. Bring them into the full Slack channel, have them embedded in the team, have them participate in activities. More collaboration and more connections, more access means better work at the end of the day. The other thing is time. In case you don't know, freelancers plan their own work according to time. They have a week and they're slotting all these different projects in that week to be able to meet their deadlines. And they need their own calendars for that. They can't really have waiting periods to start or complete a deliverable. A waiting freelancer is a freelancer whose personal calendar is getting really messed up, and that leads to worse work at the end of the day. That's why you're having all these conversations before you start. Remember to give feedback in a timely manner. It sucks to send something and hear nothing back. It always sucks. But also, if you hear feedback 2 weeks on, you have to reacclimate and context switch back onto this project every single time. So keep that in mind. The same thing applies if you require more time from your freelancers. Always remember that if you're crunching, your collaborators are crunching too. There's no such thing as one without the other. You have to acknowledge this. You can't just like bury your head in the sand and pretend that everything is fine. They're freelancers, they're used to it. You have to have a conversation about this, and don't take it for granted. And the last thing is, if your deadlines change midway through production, it's because your team can't meet a deadline. They can't produce the work in the time you've allotted ahead of time. So why wouldn't the calendar of the contractor change as well? We know that there's a date on the contract. We know that there's a deliverable. But if the whole project changes, then that contract doesn't fit with what you're making anyway. So have the conversation to open up the contract again, see how we can collaborate better, and see how we can get to the finish line together better. A topic that's very near and dear to my heart, not Garfield, iteration. This is video games. Nothing's ever right on the first try. I don't think I'm saying anything new here at GDC. Nothing ever fits on first delivery. It has to be tested, balanced, edited, reviewed, whatever the hell it is. Sorry for swearing, I'm French. There will be many passes. This is the normal process. So don't build your calendars expecting collaborators who have less visibility on your project to get it right the first time. It's not because they're bad at their jobs. It's because they need iteration just like everybody else on your team. This is the process of making games. And to that effect, integrate. We need to see our first passes in the game to know if it's good. We need to see it in action in order to improve it and make it better. This applies to everybody. Your wider team has a better perspective on the project and everything going on in the game. And getting your collaborators' work in the game will allow your team to react to this content and help improve it for future passes. To make it simple, integrate the content into the game to compensate for the fact that your collaborators are not fully integrated into your team. It's honestly, you'd be surprised at how much times we've sent scripts and we don't see them in game ever. And we get lots of notes on them, but we can't help them make them better until they're in game, and we can also add our perspective to this. We've said this a couple times before, but contractors are honing one specific skill across multiple different productions at once. Generally speaking, you are an expert in your game. You've spent thousands of hours and years learning and figuring out and knowing how to make this specific game. But think of the fact that the freelancers that you're hiring, the same thing goes for them and their field of expertise across many different games. They spend their time being the best at doing what they do across multiple different productions on multiple different scales, multiple different scopes. In our case, from AAA to a very small indie. So we know how to do narrative on any type of production. So oftentimes the problem isn't about your project, it's about making our expertise fit with the project at hand. So listen to your collaborators. They're experts. And remember, don't hire people to tell you things that you think you know better than them. That's not going to lead to successful collaboration. You hired them for a reason. Work requires vulnerability, experience, energy, and thus it requires humanity. A task can have taken 15 minutes to perform, but it requires thousands of hours honing a craft to do in this amount of time. You're paying to access a human being with life experience who knows how to do their job, so please respect that. And finally, here's something everybody knows. Games change scope during development. It's just what games do, and that's why we like doing this. Sometimes that happens while your contractors are working on the project. The thing you have to remember is, yes, we will sense it as it's happening. We'll see that like what we're trying to do doesn't quite fit with what you're doing. But they should also be told about it. You can't just assume that they'll find out from somebody else. There needs to be a conversation about the game's scope changing. Because change in scope means change in expectations. Employees can weather a change in scope because they can wait around for a little bit. You're paying them full time to weather this change. But contractors are deliverable based and they have other things going on. They need to have the relationship reevaluated and reexamined when these changes occur. Is it the right time to put an end to a relationship? Does it have to change? Does the contract need to change? Does more people need to be brought on? All these questions need to happen when you're changing the scope of your game. Now, we've given lots of advice for clients, but we also wanted to touch base on a couple points in case you're the collaborator. First, be honest with what is and what isn't your responsibility, with yourself and with the client. Be clear about what they are getting what they are getting and what you are willing to give. And that line will always move throughout the contract, so it's a conversation that needs to happen often. Get everything laid out first before you start on any work. We talked about deliverables before. This applies to contractors too. And advocate for yourself as best as you can, especially when challenges arise. This can lead to conflict, but conflict is not bad. All of the guidelines we've mentioned can and should be brought up when challenges are happening. It's not easy, but it's necessary. It's what you need to make it through those challenges to do a successful delivery of a successful project. Always make sure to build a good relationship with your clients in order to be able to have those conversations. We've told a lot to clients today to try to build relationships with you, but it's also the contractor's responsibility to build these relationships to be able to have challenging conversations. Your good clients will listen and make changes. And how do you keep going when a project keeps falling short? Well, you need to have honest conversations with the client. You need to reevaluate both your intentions and your roles. And deciding whether to push through and continue depends on their understanding of your points as a contractor. It's perfectly okay to keep going in a challenging situation as long as all parties understand that it is a challenging situation. But if not, nothing, not credits, not cash, not connections, is worth suffering. So always consider if you can leave a difficult situation. Remember that as a freelancer, you also have leverage. And that's going to help you enter these challenging conversations and oftentimes find a solution towards those challenges. So Kim is going to give you the takeaways.
Yeah, so just to kind of wrap it up with some final takeaways from this and kind of simplify things that we've talked about and give things to think on. The first is decide what you're paying for. If you're hiring someone, are you paying for their expertise? Are you paying for their hours? Are you paying for their time? Are you paying for their work? Are you paying for their muscle? Because whatever you're really, really and truly paying for beyond their knowledge is going to determine your ask. And that's what the contractor is going to use to set up their own workloads and also their own lives for the foreseeable. So that's something that's super important at the outset. You also have to decide what you're not paying for. And you have to communicate that very clearly to ensure that expectations are met and that contractors' work and time and knowledge are never wasted. Things are never done without compensation on either side, and things are not done with an expectation of pleasing a client that the client doesn't even need. And third, even if a contractor is one person versus something like us, which is a company, these relationships are still the joining of two ecosystems. And as in ecosystems, an imbalance in one area can affect another, and it can spread between the two. So always make sure that that balance is maintained. And speaking of ecosystems, if you are crunched for time, assume that rolls onto your collaborators as well. You need to be aware and be honest about the way that the project is going, the way that the studio is feeling, the way that individuals are feeling, and you define solutions early whenever you can. And finally, to really reiterate this, good collaboration requires understanding of the work and empathy for those who do it. And anything less than that, anything that doesn't feel as good as that is truly, genuinely not worth the pain. So, thank you and good luck.
Good luck. I think we might. We can do questions. I think we have 5 minutes, right? Yeah, about 5 minutes. If you want to go up to the microphone, I think it's so that Kim can hear it. And if we don't have time for all questions, we have a breakout room afterwards.
Testing. Okay.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I've got maybe an odd question. Other than being like a World of Warcraft guild leader, do you know of any software that teaches good team and task collaboration skills? Video game software specifically.
I think nothing that necessarily teaches that I can think of off the top of my head, but I think that for me, the thing that's been most valuable in terms of how to manage client collaborations has been to use genuinely happiness and well-being as a metric, and to realize that that is fundamental to the work. I think a lot of the time, especially in contract situations early on, there's this temptation to say, okay, well, this is frustrating, I'm hurting, but I'm a contractor, I have to keep this work, I have to do this thing. And to say, well, I'm just dealing with this stress, I'm just dealing with this bad feeling. And that spreads to a team. That spreads very easily to a team. And the biggest help has been just examining how are people feeling in this space, and how can I address that? Because the second that you start paying attention to, I think, the flow of those emotions, the flow of that power and the way that people are feeling and the way that people are being handled, you can start to, I think, get a better picture of what needs to be done. Because ultimately, even as a contractor, the way that I think about deliverables sometimes is not, what is this deliverable, when is it due, why am I going to panic about it? It's, what value does this have to the person or team I'm giving it to, and how do they feel about it? The urgency is often determined by the energy. And I think that's kind of something. So I would even generally start looking just towards community building and the ways that communities work, and then start applying that to the models of collaboration.
So just quickly then, happiness for the contractors and the team would probably equate to quality of the work.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, okay. Because I think you can get work of a certain quality no matter what, right? You can beat work or out of people. That's happened, and it's awful, right? And I think the games industry is very, very happy to do that a lot of the time. But I think fundamentally, when it comes to building a team that lasts, to building a team that you want to stay with, and to keeping a bunch of people, especially as contractors, for me, that's very important, right? To have those relationships. That kindness is necessary to any development at all. And if you reach a point with someone who really does have that knowledge, who has enough experience, that line that they can draw, that boundary they can put down, is very firm. And I think that it all comes down to, are we having a good time? Is there joy being created here? Is it worth it? And it has to be.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go there first. I think he was there first.
Oh, thank you. Actually, I just have a short remark, because my company is actually built exclusively on collaborators, and I wanted to share my experiences with that. First off, thank you for the talk, because I can really agree with everything that you said. And my experience was at the beginning very scary because I had the intentions to include my collaborators, and I wasn't sure whether they actually want to be included or whether they just want to make money and then just go. And we had in the beginning these discussions with the meetings, like they were like, let's not do too many meetings. I was like, oh, let's see whether that works out. And I just want to share, it actually worked out great, and my collaborators actually love working and being included everywhere, and I can only encourage everyone here, try to hire collaborators and integrate them as well as possible into your team.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing. Yeah. Yes, next question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you have tips on how to decide beforehand what is going to be a good collaborative relationship, if you have a way of like tips of how to assess whether a company is going to be a good fit.
I'm happy to speak to that. For me, it's like one, anything can change, right? Like leadership can change, and there's no surefire way to say it. But I think that at the outset, it's been very, very important for me and for us to establish our values very clearly, and to say that like this is something that's going to have to happen, and to be very outright about the way that I don't just perceive this work, but that I perceive the work of games, that I perceive this industry. For me, at this point, if I can't be honest when I'm meeting a Sweet Baby client for our team about the fact that this industry is broken, then I don't think that's going to be a positive relationship. But it took me several years of being in a position of relative, comfort in this industry to even be able to bring that up. Because I think that if right now we don't see the problems, if they don't see like the systemic issues that are going to be holding us back, then I don't know that there's a collaboration that can even happen in an equitable way. So it's about value matching and making sure that that perspective is the same beyond even the work and technical matching, I think.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. I really appreciate it. I wanted to dig a little bit into, you were talking about integrate.
Yes.
Just having experiences with, where narrative is trying to be structured into the game, it's like, hey, you're making this narrative, let's play test it, and sometimes contractors are working a bit earlier. It really depends when that's available. Do you have any thoughts about what kind of structures are useful for integrating narrative in a way that's successful?
I think that the most important thing is to, as contractors, it's really hard to learn every specific engine and project and how integration happens. So having somebody on your end as a client who is able to integrate the work is always very, very helpful.
Sure.
And sometimes it's impossible, and that's okay, but to be upfront about it and say, okay, well, we don't have the resources to integrate right now, so the calendar will match when we can integrate, knowing that your second pass will happen when we can integrate. And that recording will happen after you've done a second pass. Making sure that the calendar reflects the actual capabilities of the project to integrate the work inside the engine.
Yeah, and I should add also that like design documents and stuff can be immensely helpful in that way. I think that the aim is mostly to ensure that the contractor has the same perspective on the integrated gameplay as you do. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have integrated gameplay, that's okay, because that means that we're still aligned. It's more that a lot of the time, because the team is working together very intimately and very connected, they have kind of an invisible knowledge that the contractor doesn't. And so being able to kind of package up and provide that knowledge in a build, in a design breakout, and something like that means that your contractor gets armed the same way as your team.
Cool. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Oh, hi. Javier.
Hi. Thank you so much, first of all, for having this talk. I feel like especially at GDC, it's so easy for the industry to get caught up in this cycle of like backpatting about here's this game that was so successful and here are our staff designers that are talking about it, and then all of the like hundreds of people that have been collaborators on it aren't credited in like any meaningful way. And I noticed that like especially impacting like creators of color, creators of marginalized genders. Do you have any impactful strategies or frameworks that you can advise people to engage with the subject of labor accreditation in any meaningful way?
I think for accreditation, it's an uphill battle right now. I think industry-wide it's a huge push, but for me, the only thing I can do is advocate for it. And on any team, even before the question is asked, I often try to soft discuss it the same way that I would talk about I want to know genuinely, like a lot of the time, what the team's perspective is on the industry. what a team's perspective is on the issues that we suffer. I want to know what they feel about accreditation at the outset. I think that's something important to really discuss, and also to make sure that it's in the contract in areas, especially where you don't trust that. No matter the team, no matter how kind, no matter what anything, having that on paper is super important and means that you will be guaranteed a place on this. But I think largely for me, the biggest fight to have, or the biggest way to advocate, is to do it at the outset before any work even begins. Is to treat it the same way that you would treat any kind of relationship, where at the beginning, right? There's, for me, that rule of dating that I've always heard but hated is like, well, you don't discuss this, don't discuss politics, don't discuss this, don't discuss that. For me, it's like, no, any kind of relationship that I enter into is going to be really, really, colored by that person's perception. Because I'm not just coming in as a writer, I am coming in as Kim Belair, a black writer who is from this background, who has this company, who has this team. And none of all that enters into the world for me. So I have to make those safeguards before I can even consider anything else. So I think always having that, finding advocates, like finding people, I'm always happy to have those talks. Folks like myself in the industry, people who are there, I'm happy to have that, but advocacy and community are the most important parts fundamentally, and then just bringing that up to any client, I think, matters.
Awesome. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
I'm just going to check it for, I know it was supposed to be third. Can we keep going? Yeah? All right, cool.
So, one quick question. When it comes to collaboration, as you mentioned, scope changes a lot throughout the process. And there are times where, because of scope being limited, we have to cut out some things.
Yes.
In terms of cutting content that has been worked on by a collaborator, when do we really communicate that, and how? Like, what is the best way to approach that communication?
I think with kindness.
This just happened to us. So,
with
yeah.
kindness and with understanding that despite their role outside being external to the team, the work was valuable, and the work was meant something to them. And I think, the reality of scope is that sometimes things don't make it in, but I think the importance of any situation like that is to realize who's losing something, and that it's not just, it's easy to say, like, well, we had to make that on our side, it was a production decision, but it was a creative decision to that person. And I think just approach them with that knowledge and say, hey, look, you did work, you're still valued, and we're going to credit you for it. It got cut for scope reasons, and we understand how painful it is, but we want you to be prepared for that. And I think that for me is the only thing we can do, because there are realities, that we can't change, and I think we just have to talk around them.
I also want to add, if you can, involve your collaborators in those decisions, in what needs to be cut. If the scope concern is we need to cut X number of minutes from this game, as narrative collaborators, we can help you find the best minutes that won't completely undermine a lot of the structural work that we've done for the narrative of your game. I know from the project perspective, it might be easy to go, well, these are the easiest ones to cut for us, but then it might make your narrative way worse. So always try to involve your collaborators in those discussions and be upfront about, like, this is why we need to cut this content, and any information you have for us is appreciated.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't know who was first. I'm going to bounce around. Yeah, okay.
Hi.
Hi.
First off, thank you very much, Kim, David. I had no offense to any other presenters this week, but for me personally, this may have been the most beneficial and valuable seminar I've attended.
Thank you.
And speaking from a contractor outside of the game development industry, my question for you guys is, do you think that the end goal, or the real solution for a lot of the problems that you're talking about and you're having occur within the industry, would be more control, or rather more implied control and a seat at the table of product and project management and development down the road?
Yes.
Yeah, I think 100%.
So second part to that, I'm sorry, but would be, wouldn't the representation of the contractors within the industry in and of itself be the key point and solution to that end goal?
Yeah,
I think so. I think that that's, that kind of advocacy and representation is super important, and I think that hopefully within years, our industry will be better at that. And I think that's like reform on a very, very large level. And I think until then, that is why for me, like a lot of these channels are like having communities of contractors, having these open discussions, having even, you know, for us, we made a company that is essentially a contractor filled with full-time folks, and that has allowed us to have a certain measure of like, you know, freedom of movement because of that size. But I think that all that says to me is that that's what we need on a huge macro level, and is something that, yeah, I think we could, I could talk about this for a very long time, but I do think it's the only, moving towards a world in which there is more,
and I think
there's more room for representation is huge.
You mentioned control, and I think that might be one of the issues. Is it's not so much about control; it's about influence. It's about being able to have the conversation at the moment where it needs to happen, as opposed to then having to assert some sort of control to be able to rectify the situation. It's about, you know, not being afraid to let those people in the room who you need to let in early on.
Well,
right?
the key to that's honestly leverage.
Yes.
And it's speaking from a categorical industry where our contractor base does have that leverage, that's going to be a key point.
Yeah.
So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This will be the last question.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you. I come from a country where game development is still like advancing, so I feel like I shouldn't give me the luxury of rejecting jobs just because they are not healthy, and I am lucky enough to be in a position where I can like teach them healthy relationships with game developers because they are not used to it. They are like, you guys are like the hammer analogy you said. So my question is how to tackle this with my clients. How can I like teach them these healthy relationships?
So I think it's going to be it's always a battle, right? Because I think that fundamentally, I believe in what you're doing, and I will do it as well, right? I think that it's always worth going to the table. My rule is that I will always show up at the table for that discussion. If someone is being, especially someone who's holding power, is being challenging, is having an issue, and I have the strength, advocacy, and safety to be able to say, okay, I'm gonna sit in this room and have that conversation, I'm always gonna do it. I think it's important to challenge that power. It's important to ask them the very tough questions. You know, for me in narrative, a lot of the time that question is just like, okay, you've asked me here to write a black character. And the question I can ask that's very challenging for a lot of people to answer is, why did you make them black? Just that. And that question is going to give me the information that I need. So I think it's about not necessarily teaching them, but interrogating them and having them explain to you the framework by which they are currently working, the framework by which they are currently behaving badly. And then it falls back to you, I think, to decide, is this a person who can be taught? Is this a person whose framework allows for a change of opinion or a change in behavior? Or is this a person who cannot be changed? Because I think that's the line, right? There's a line that especially, you know, coming from the background that I do, there's a lot of stuff that I've had to just deal with. I've had to just eat just a lot of stuff and go, okay, that has to happen. But what I have never benefited from was a situation that was purely detrimental. At a certain point, I have to be able to know that I can create shields, guards, and structures that will keep me safe despite how bad things are on that other side. So I think it's, always go to the table, always ask them questions about their perspective, and let their answers determine whether that fight is even worth having. And then when you are having that fight, I think it's just important to just always remember that, like, this is about people. This is about bringing people into a situation. And this is about, if you want to have access to humans, you have to be human. Yeah. And I think that's like the core factor, because eventually there will always be a point that you should leave in, and that it is unhealthy on a way that cannot be mitigated. And I think that the challenge is finding where that level sits for you specifically.
I think a good metric to use, and you know, being able to walk away is a privilege. But at the same time, if as a contractor you're juggling multiple contracts and one of them is hurting your other contracts, this is a good sign to start having those conversations and start making those decisions. Because if your whole stock as a creator is falling, and your energy levels are falling because of one specific challenge, then that affects you more than it affects them.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. I don't know if it's needed. I'm going to be in like the breakout room for like, I don't know, 30 minutes or something.